My name is L.J. Stambuk, and I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. I want to welcome you to the first speaker series program of the year of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. And do we have a treat? Dr. Shibley Telhami does not need a lot of introduction. I had the opportunity and the privilege to hear him speak at the World Affairs Councils of America National Security Conference 2 years ago, and I learned so much. I've been following Dr. Shibley for a long time. We both went to Cornell, myself as a student, Dr. Telhami as a professor, and my regret is I was not there as a student when he was there as a professor. So we'll make up today.
I'm Mike Hawley, member of the board of the World Affairs Council. And you know, when you think about it, it's always a signature event for us at the World Affairs Council to have a person like Shibley Telhami spend time with us. He's a renowned intellect and visionary in many respects, but certainly with respect to the Middle East. You know, when you also think about it, I mean, this is a spectacular time to have Dr. Telhami speak with us, but it's also a very tragic and troubling one for the Middle East. The Middle East could not be more complex, complicated, or dangerous than it is this very day. You know, if you think about all of the events that are going on today, yesterday, this is about as difficult and interesting a time as we could ever hope to have Dr. Telhami visit with us on. You know, when you think that the Russian ambassador is coming next week, this is really our mission at the World Affairs Council, is to be a catalyst for global thinking. And I think with Dr. Telhami today and the Russian ambassador next week, it's a pretty impressive demonstration of that mission. As Lubomir said, Dr. Telhami really doesn't require any introduction, and I'm not going to give you much of one. You've undoubtedly looked at all of his biographical material and the flyers that we've sent around. You probably have heard him speak in many other venues. But just to touch on a couple of things, you know, he is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. And he's currently a faculty member at the University of Maryland and holds the Anwar Sadat chair there. You know, he's been a professor at various places and lectured at various places, Ohio State, and as Lubomir suggested to you, Lubomir's alma mater, Cornell. He's a prolific author, commentator. He spent a great deal of time in cauldrons of deep thinking like Berkeley and Princeton, as well as having spent a lot of time in places that might be described as the antithesis of that, Washington, D.C. So, you know, it's indeed a great honor and privilege for me to ask all of you to please welcome, in a Charlotte way, Dr. Telhami.
Thanks so much. It's really an honor and pleasure for me to be here. I know, heard about this chapter, some wonderful things, and I'm a big fan of the World Affairs Council. I really appreciate what this organization does in every major city. You know, the world is interconnected, and it's impossible to have excellence in anything now unless you really understand how it's connected globally, and I truly appreciate what you have done. And I'm also, in the first place, a teacher, so I'm really happy to see that you also bring students to hear these lectures, so I'm grateful for that as well. Let me just start by saying, before I give you my formal remarks and then open it up for questions and answers, that while I'm going to focus my remarks specifically on themes that come out of my new book that then connect with what's happening in the Middle East right now, I am following a lot of issues by virtue of what I do every day. I'm still continuing to do public opinion polling in the Middle East. I just did one among Israelis, both Arabs and Jews, and among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I follow the Arab-Israeli issue. I follow what's happening in Egypt. I just recently returned from an extensive trip to Egypt. I follow what's happening in Syria. We now have negotiations underway there. I follow the Iran issue and write about it. So when we have the questions and answers, feel free to go beyond my formal presentation to any of these issues. I'm not going to touch on them directly because I'm going to make my remarks focused and brief. The second point I want to make is that just to put in context my remarks, and particularly the book, The World Through Arab Eyes, that has been available here, that came out recently, I have been studying Arab public opinion for over 2 decades, when in fact very few people thought Arab public opinion mattered. And people used to say, well, the Middle East is made up mostly of dictatorships or authoritarian rulers who don't have to worry about what their public wants or thinks, or at a minimum they can reshape it, or they can tell them what to think because they monopolize the media. And even then, some 25 years ago, it wasn't entirely true. It's true that governments could do a lot and can somewhat disregard their publics. Even before the Arab uprisings, it wasn't entirely true. But to give you a flavor, my very first book that I wrote came out of my dissertation. It was about the Camp David negotiations between Egypt and Israel with the American mediation, President Jimmy Carter, that successful episode of negotiations. And I remember at that time thinking, as I was writing the book, how the Israelis and to some extent the Americans didn't quite understand that Sadat, the president of Egypt then, surely he was an authoritarian ruler. He didn't have to worry about getting elected. He can certainly monopolize the media in his country, and still had to worry about his public opinion. And there was a fight between him and then Prime Minister Menachem Begin in the middle of the negotiations, where at the start of those negotiations at Camp David, Maryland, the Prime Minister of Israel tells Sadat, I would like you to do X, Y, Z. And he says, I can't do it because my public wouldn't let me. And he said, what do you mean your public wouldn't let you? You're essentially a dictator. You can have them do what you want them to do. Sadat was so angry that, in fact, they had to be separated for the duration of the negotiations. They never sat together in the same room until the very end. That's how angry he was, because he thought people didn't understand that he still had to worry about his public opinion. In fact, interestingly, just a few weeks ago, the CIA released new documents that have been declassified, dating back to that period. And the CIA, actually, the analysts have been pretty good, by the way. I mean, in general, a lot of the declassified materials that we have, there are some, obviously it varies, some are better than others, but by and large, the CIA had some reasonably good analysts reporting from the field on the situation. There was one particular document that was interesting that was released, and it pertained to Egypt itself as Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, undertook his diplomacy toward Israel. And the CIA document said something like this. Sadat has support from the military, that's central, he's got it essentially in the bank. He's got support from the bureaucracy, those are that matters. Well, as for public opinion, public opinion doesn't matter. At the time, they counted Egypt to be 35 million people. Now, by the way, Egypt is about 80 million people. This document was dating back 1977. So they count, of those 35 million, they specify roughly 32 million that they say they don't count. They don't matter. They don't matter. Well, that may be true in the making of policy. But here's the tragedy. Sadat signed a deal, and he didn't make a lot of compromises, by the way. He did it within the normal, what he thought to be Egypt's national interest. He was assassinated. He paid with his life. Not only that, that was the beginning of the Islamist militancy that gave rise to Ayman Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda now. And so you can say public opinion doesn't matter in the direct way of influencing the decision of a government official, but you can't say it doesn't matter for the broader politics. That's really what got me thinking, even then, before the rise of the Arab uprisings, long before the rise of the Arab uprisings, what got me thinking into that we need to study the relevance of public opinion. We need to understand it more. We need to understand what the publics in the Middle East want, and we need to understand how it matters in politics. And by the 1990s, we had a real revolution take place. That's the information revolution, which meant that with the rise of satellite television in the Arab world, no longer could governments monopolize information of the people. And so we've had a fantastic revolution that made public opinion even more independent and more relevant for politics. So we started doing public opinion polling in the Arab world, particularly in 6 countries: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Morocco, the United Arab Emirates, and Lebanon, year after year, to understand, what is driving public opinion? What do Arabs want as a people? Understanding that they're diverse and they don't necessarily all want the same thing, that they vary from country to country, understanding these differences. So the book, in a way, is an analysis of these findings on all sorts of issues, not only the attitudes toward the world broadly, but attitudes toward the U.S., attitude toward other powers, attitude toward the conflict like the Arab-Israeli issue, the Iran issue, the Iraq issue, but also attitudes toward social issues like religious groups, political Islam, the role of women in society. So it's a lot of issues that are out there that I'm not going to talk about. I'm going to just make 3 points very quickly, and then I'm going to open up for discussion. The first point is that while it's very important to study public opinion of any kind, whether it's American public opinion or Arab public opinion, European public opinion, the most interesting thing about the study of public opinion is not what the public thinks at a moment. I mean, that's a snapshot. We all know public opinion changes. They can say they like someone today, and they can say they like someone else tomorrow. That's interesting at any given time, but that's not really what's intellectually interesting. That's not really what's analytically interesting. So what is interesting? What's interesting is to understand the prism through which people look when they express a public opinion. The framework of reference that they use when they announce their public opinion. That is, what is it that makes them tick? What is it that is important to them in the context of which they are giving this opinion that they're giving today or giving this opinion tomorrow? Or how is that likely to change over time? One issue for sure that's critical to understanding that, what I call the prism through which Arabs see the world, is how they define themselves, what I call Arab identity. And so the first point I want to make has to do about identity in the Arab world and how it's evolved and why that's important. And the second point I want to make is the relevance of foreign policy. I think we've heard a lot about the Arab uprisings, or what people have termed the Arab Spring. Well, people say, well, this is not about foreign policy at all. In some ways it's not, but in other ways it is. And you can't separate the two, and I want to give you some examples of that. And the third point I want to make is, so what should we conclude? What are the Arab uprisings about? What do they mean? What is likely to happen down the road? How do they vary from country to country? Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Bahrain. I want to give you some very quick comments on that issue. Let me start with the issue of identity. Identity is extremely important for understanding public opinion because I think in some ways, when people have a strong identity, whether it's political identity or social identity or any kind of form of collective identity, their views on some issues are already preformed. And even when they go to a particular media outlet, it's not that the media shapes their opinion. It is more likely that they choose the media that reflects who they are. Look, for Fox News Watch viewers are predisposed to accept what Fox News gives. MSNBC viewers are predisposed to accept what MSNBC does. They go to it in part because it reflects who they are, not the other way around. And that's true, of course, everywhere. It's true in the Arab media. It's true everywhere, with some exceptions to the rule, of course. But by and large, identity matters a lot. And one thing we have found over a whole decade of polling, year after year, is that there has been some transformation in the way Arabs identify themselves over the past decade plus. And that is consequential. And yet it's also misunderstood. So I'm going to start with that. What have we found with regard to Arab identity? Well, one of the things that we try to probe is Arabs politically or collectively generally identify themselves as Arab or mostly Muslim, some of them Christian, obviously in places like Egypt, Lebanon, and elsewhere. They identify with the state, Egypt or Jordan or Morocco, and some of them identify themselves as just citizens of the world. They're egalitarian. And so we tried to figure out which one of these increased over the decade, which one of these decreased over the decade. And here's the interesting data. Finding number one is that their identification with the state has declined over the past decade and a half, meaning they're less likely to say they're Egyptian first or Jordanian first or Saudi first or Moroccan first. And their Arab identity has remained robust, hasn't changed much. And their Islamic identity, the propensity to say I'm Muslim first, increased over the decade, more than the others. Now, there are variations from country to country. Those of you who've been to the Middle East can appreciate the differences between Morocco and Yemen and Saudi Arabia and Lebanon. Those are not identical cultures. They're not even identical in the way they identify themselves. In fact, we found some fascinating differences. For example, Lebanon, a country that's fractured, the most sectarian country in the Middle East. I say the most sectarian in part because there's not a single sect that constitutes a majority in Lebanon. So in that sense, it's a fractured country that fought a civil war. And yet it is the country where its people feel most Lebanese. Every single faction, whether it's Shia or Sunni or Maronite Christian or Greek Catholic Christian or Druze, is more likely to say they're Lebanese first above everything else. And Saudi Arabia, its citizens are the least likely to say they're Saudi first. Less than 20% of the people say they're Saudi first. And Egypt is the most balanced country, where people almost equally say they're Egyptian and Muslim and Arab. So there are variations across the Arab world, even though aggregately the change is along the lines that I described. A decline of affinity with the state, an increase of affinity with Islam. And so that, coupled with the fact that after the Arab uprisings, what we witnessed was really an increase in Islam, the power of political Islam. We saw what happened in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood winning the parliamentary election and the presidency. Islamists did well in Tunisia, they did well in Libya. And so there was then an interpretation that I think swept our discourse, which said this change that has occurred at the level of identity over the past decade is an indication of the rise of political Islam in the Arab world. I'd like to disagree with that. And I'm going to give you a lot of reasons to think that was a flawed analysis of what happened in the Arab world, or what people meant when they said they're Muslim. First indication is that in our analysis, we don't find an embrace of political Islam in the polling. And actually, when you talk about even an imposition of Sharia law in a puritanical way like the Taliban we found throughout the whole decade very few people embracing it. That's not true. And second, when people say I'm a Muslim, by the way, it's very hard to know whether people are asserting their religious identity, their cultural identity, or political identity when they say I'm a Muslim first. The Middle East is one of the most religious places on earth in some ways. I mean, Egyptians, for example, almost universally tell you they're religious in some aspect. Over 90%, almost 100% of the Egyptian population, says that they're religious. But what we found, and I think there's evidence of this, is that while you have people who really embrace political Islam, perhaps, a certain minority, where you have people feeling strongly about the religious belief. The rise in Islamic identification is also in part a function of you are what you have to defend, as someone once put it. Meaning there was a sense for the whole decade that Islam was under assault. In fact, if we looked at our public opinion polling, particularly in the period after the Iraq War, really after 9/11, and sort of, but especially the Iraq War, there was an interpretation in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, that there was a clash of civilization with an assault on Islam. We found that in the polling as one of the highest indicators of assessment of Western, particularly American, intention toward the Muslim world. And so that particular rise in identity is not necessarily connected to political Islam as such. The second thing I want to say about this is that when we look at the reasoning for people, increasing their identification with what I call transnational movement that is outside their own boundary, like Islam or Arab, at the expense of the state, is also in part a function of the rise of the new media, meaning the satellite television and certainly the internet. We see this in the analysis, namely that the rise of the satellite television, particularly Al Jazeera, that you hear about a lot, has done one fascinating thing, which is because it appeals to all Arabs across boundaries, the Al Jazeera, even though it's out of Qatar, is trying to reach the Moroccans and the Saudis and the Egyptians. It really caters to that which is common among the Arab, which is Muslim and Arab. And therefore, that has increased their sense of collective identity across the boundaries. So the bottom line is, I don't think this is an indication of the rise of political Islam. The second point I want to make overall is about foreign policy. I know that when we saw the uprisings, particularly in Egypt and Tunisia, early on in what is termed the Arab Spring, a lot of people said foreign policy has absolutely nothing to do with it. In fact, you didn't see slogans of foreign policy so much in Tahrir Square in Cairo or in Tunisia, and I was in both places immediately after both revolutions, trying to mix with the people and understand what they're expressing in terms of aspirations. And there weren't all that many symbols of foreign policy issues. And the take on it was, this is really a plight for freedom from authoritarian rulers. They want better food, better jobs, they want better schools, they want food on the table, all of which is absolutely true, undoubtedly true, no question about it. And that was in some ways represented in a word that the Arab publics used it in every country, from Tunisia all the way to Yemen, and that was dignity, that this is all about achieving dignity, meaning the freedom, the relationship between themselves and the ruler has to be dignified, the relations with the rest of society has to be dignified, and obviously food and jobs and schooling all can be packed into that term. But many of our analysts said, well, therefore, foreign policy isn't really an issue for them. That is a misrepresentation of what happened, because what I'd like to argue and what we show in the book is that while the dignity that they seek is in the first place in the relationship between themselves and the ruler, it cannot be unpacked from that dignity that they see the rulers not representing in the relationship with the outside world. The two cannot be decoupled. And in fact, I would go further and I would say, if you look at the decade that preceded the Arab uprisings, and you ask yourself, what was distinctive about that decade that would have maybe compelled Arabs to do more, to try to get rid of these dictators in the Arab world? You're hard-pressed to find a particularly unique set of circumstances that had to do with jobs, with food, or with other kind of economic indicators. Those indicators were not pretty, but they were not pretty 2 decades before, and they're not pretty in some other regions in the world where we don't see uprisings. The most distinctive part about that decade was upheavals in foreign policy. Basically, that was the post-9/11 decade, and more so the Iraq War decade. And when you look at the Arab press and even what angered Arabs for the whole decade in our polling, you will find that it was the collapse of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in 2000 and the bloodshed that was all over the new satellite television. You find the Iraq War and the devastation and the consequences of the Iraq War. You find the 2006 Israeli-Lebanese war with Hezbollah. You find the 2008 and 2009 war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Those are the issues that galvanize the public. And they galvanize the public in a sense of being even more angry with the rulers for taking the wrong side on most of these issues and for not being able to do what the public wanted them to do on those issues. And that can't be decoupled from their anger with other things. And let me give you one final example related to that. One of the questions I ask in the polling over the whole decade is a straightforward question, which is, whom among world leaders do you admire most? Just a simple question. Outside your own country. I don't want them to be in a position to judge their own rulers. And now, remember what I said up front. I said, you know, my aim in doing these polls isn't to really get the answer as much as to get at what is making them give this answer. And it's very telling. And let me give you the example. Now, in 2003, 2004, this is the Iraq War, the heat of the Iraq War. We are talking here in America about what? We're talking about a clash of civilization. That's the thesis about what explains what we're facing in the Middle East. And I ask in the Arab world, name the ruler, the leader that you admire most in the world. Open question. I don't give them names. Number one answer, Jacques Chirac of France. Now just mull this over a little bit in your head. Jacques Chirac of France. Now, clash of civilization, anti-Western, you know, he's a representative not only of a Western country, but a country with very, imperialistic history in the Middle East, more so than America. And a country that was facing issues with Arab immigrants in France, a country that was facing the issue of the veil in French schools. And they say Jacques Chirac. Why would they say Jacques Chirac? Well, it's very simple, because the prism through which they were making an evaluation was not social issue, was not religious issues. They were making it through two specific issues. The Iraq War, Jacques Chirac was seen to have stood up to George W. Bush on the Iraq War, and Jacques Chirac hosted Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat on his deathbed in Paris and treated him like a head of state and died like a head of state in Paris at a time when he was being isolated by the United States. It was a defiance. They were embracing him for those two issues. That's the prism through which they were making an evaluation. Fast forward another year or two, 2006, 2007. Now the discourse changes. Remember, it started with the clash of civilization. 2 years after the Iraq War, guess what the new scheme is? Shia-Sunni divide. We have everybody talking about the Sunni-Shia divide. And there is a Sunni-Shia divide. And we saw sectarianism in Iraq. And one reason why people were saying that is we had all this bloodshed that was sectarian coming out of Iraq. And then Iran's new role, and we talk about Sunni-Shia divide. And here I am in the middle of this discourse of people here in Washington, in the US, arguing, now we witness a different Middle East where the prism through which they make an evaluation is the Sunni-Shia divide. And I am polling in mostly Sunni countries. In Egypt, the largest of Sunni Arab countries, 80 million people, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. And I'm asking them, who's the leader you admire most in the world? And they name the Shia ruler of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, as their most admired man, a man hated by their governments. And why do they do that? Well, they do it not because they like it for religious reasons, but the prism of evaluation, again, is defiance. This is the man who fought what they thought was an effective war with Israel in 2006. And that alone led to their looking at him as a hero. Fast forward a couple more years down the road, 2009. The number one most admired ruler in the Arab world was Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. And you ask, what do they know about Hugo Chavez? They don't. They don't need to know. They were basically expressing something, because he was the only leader to break diplomatic relations with Israel after the Gaza war of 2008-2009. That's all they needed to know. And the same could be said in the following year when the leader of Turkey, Erdogan, was selected as the most admired leader, particularly after the so-called Turkish flotilla confrontation with Israel, and rewarding him for his sense of defiance. In 2011, by the way, in Saudi Arabia and Jordan, something fascinating happened. This is the year after the beginning of the Arab uprising, when people saying this is the era of freedom, what people want, Democrats and so forth. And what we see in those two countries is the most admired leader was Saddam Hussein. And again, because of his sense of defiance and anger for what happened after the Iraq War. What I'm suggesting to you is that whatever it is that we think motivated people in decades prior to the Arab uprising, and there were many reasons why they were angry with the people, with the governments, and that's because the governments didn't deliver, and they were lousy, and they didn't give them freedom, and they didn't give them jobs, and all of that is true. But you can't decouple that from this added anger that had to do with foreign policy. And you can't decouple their identity, how they define themselves, from their views on foreign policy. And that's why, by the way, you might wonder when you look at what's happening in Egypt. And here we are, the United States of America have done not, I think, too bad a job initially dealing with the Arab uprisings. And yet, in Egypt, a place that is important to the U.S. and has been an anchor in some ways of American policy in the Middle East, when you go and you hear the discourse, and you find that the U.S. is getting it from both sides. The Muslim Brotherhood attacks the U.S. for being behind the generals, and the generals attack the U.S. for being behind the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Egyptian public, everybody is angry with the U.S. That's not because of what the U.S. is doing now. Because no matter what the U.S. does now, even if it does something for good reasons, like intervene for humanitarian reasons in Syria, people will still see it as an imperialistic act. And the reason for it is that the evaluation of America has to do with their sense of American intention based on decades of policy, mostly related to the Gulf and the Arab-Israeli issue, which I call the prism of pain through which Arabs see the world. So it's very hard to decouple those issues. And I think people don't quite understand it. They think if we just do the right thing, withhold aid from Egypt, give more aid to Egypt, or shoot at Assad or not shoot at Assad, that's going to transform perspectives of the Arab public toward the U.S. It won't do it, because that's not the prism through which they make an evaluation. Final comment I want to make, and then I'll open it for questions. So what is it that we're witnessing in the Middle East now? What is it different? What's different about it? I mean, there have been revolts in the past in the Arab world. Is this different? Is it going away? How is it going to unfold? And I'd like to submit to you that this is different, that this is profound, that there's no going back. And I'm going to give you one reason why that's true, not really so much connected to a the nature of how things have unfolded. The most important thing that has happened in the Arab world is what I call Arab public empowerment. The public is empowered in the Arab world. There is a sense of the end of fear. There is a sense of empowerment on a scale that we had never witnessed before, and it is principally a function of the information revolution. An information revolution that is only expanding. There's no going backward. No government can put the genie back in the bottle because economic progress is now dependent on that information revolution. And so governments can't control the media. They can't tell people what to believe. And the people not only have their way of accessing media that other than what governments provide, but they also use the media, particularly the internet and social media, in empowering ways. Meaning what? Meaning organizing without the need for political parties, without the need for leadership, as happened in Tunisia and Egypt in the Arab uprisings themselves. So you have a public that is empowered. That's not going back. It's a new element of politics in the Arab world that's with us to stay. But here's the other side of this. The fact that you have an Arab public empowered doesn't mean the end of politics means the beginning of the politics. First of all, it doesn't mean the public unified. So you have the ultra-religious, the moderate religious, and the secular, and the liberal. They're all empowered, and they don't all see eye to eye. So there's contention. You have the rich and the poor. You have the sectarian element in places that are sectarian, like Syria and Bahrain. And so the more divided a polity is, the more diverse it is, the more heterogeneous it is, the more complicated it is. That's number one. And number two, even aside from the diversity of opinion within every society, it's never the case that public opinion determines an outcome. Even in our country, I mean, public opinion matters here, but our governments do things that public doesn't want. Quite often, sometimes we're puzzled why we would have a shutdown in Washington and everybody's angry. We know that corporations matter, militaries matter, bureaucracies matter. All of that hasn't changed. So you have a beginning of new, more contentious politics, not the end of politics. And so as we look across the Arab world, that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing that some elements of old politics, of bureaucracies and institutions and militaries that are trying to defend their turf, but you have a newly empowered public that wants its voice heard. And if there is a ruler that thinks that they can put that genie back in the bottle and go back to authoritarian rule and repress the public so that the public would not risk having its voice heard, I think they don't understand what's happening. I think this is with us to stay, and therefore we're really upon a period of much turbulence in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Telhami, on your comments. Now we're going to take a few minutes and open up the session to question and answers.
How did the Brotherhood win Egypt, and what changed? And that seems to be something that's never seen in American media. Could you explain that a little?
Absolutely. I follow Egypt very closely, and I was there really right after Mubarak was overthrown in one of the huge gatherings in Tahrir Square. I was there a few months before the Brotherhood was overthrown as well. I could tell you a conversation that's interesting and telling. When I went to Egypt in 2013, I was there recently again. I went to visit the office of President Morsi himself, the Muslim Brotherhood president. And I met with his top foreign policy advisor. Had a very good conversation with him. And I recall that, and it was a frank conversation. I told him sort of what people, why people are angry and why even people in America and Washington particularly were angry with the way they're performing. And one of the things I said was, I asked him, I said, I don't see you broadening the government and the Constitution to encompass the broad coalition that was behind the revolution. And he said, "What do you mean? We had a Constitution that won almost 2/3 of the public. About 64% voted for the Constitution." I said, "Yes, but you only had 33% of the people vote altogether in that round of election. And one reason they didn't vote is they just didn't even want to take a position. They were so opposed to the Constitution." And then I added, "And even then, you didn't have Cairo. You lost Cairo even for the Constitution." And he said, "Cairo is not Egypt." And I said, "Yes, but it's the heart of Egypt. You can win an election without Cairo, but you can't govern without Cairo." And Cairo to me was a metaphor. Cairo wasn't just about the city, but about all the capable people who can run things, including in Alexandria and Mansoura, any other city. It's just that elites that have, yes, they have vested interest in many things for sure, but you can't ignore them. They're the ones who run the country. And so that was really kind of my take on it. And I think what happened with the Brotherhood is that if you look back at their early aspirations, they played their cards very close to the chest when the revolution started. Nobody expected Mubarak to be overthrown so quickly. And if you look at what they did as an organization in Egypt, they didn't embrace the uprisings quickly. They did so when it looked like they were so massive that it really could work. And when they did, and you had that overthrow of Mubarak, and then you had a transitional government with the military, they actually thought they could work with the military. And they were sending signals that they can more comfortable with the status quo, which is why I think many elements of the military preferred to work with the Muslim Brotherhood than with the ultra-liberals that they used to think to be anarchists. And they thought the Brotherhood could be contained, that they can give them a voice in the parliament, but the president would be someone else. And the Brotherhood was saying they don't even want to run a presidential candidate. But when they smelled power and they got a majority in the parliament, and they realized how disorganized the opposition was, and they were fearing also the competition from the other Islamists like the Salafis, they decided to run for the presidency. And the lack of organization of the alternatives really is why they won. Remember, Morsi, when he first ran, in the first round of the Egyptian elections, when there were multiple candidates, he got only 26% of the Egyptian vote. Only 26%, quarter of the Egyptian vote. And even in the second round, he barely beat one of Mubarak's men, Ahmed Shafiq. So I think they overestimated and misinterpreted what's happening in Egypt, both in terms of political and military attitude. But I also think it's a mistake for the military to misinterpret them. Because while they don't have a majority, and I don't believe they ever had a majority of supporters, and while they may be a group that many Egyptians reject, they still have core support. And I submit to you, if they were allowed to run in the next parliamentary elections, they could win between 20 to 25% of the Egyptian parliamentary seats. Well, that tells me you can't ignore them. And anyone who thinks they can, I think, is in for a lot of surprises.
Hi, I'm Paul Prohaska with Bank of America, and I appreciate you sharing your insights, so thank you very much. My question has to do with Iran, and then again the Arab Prism, the Arab Street. With the current negotiations to curtail Iran's nuclear ambitions, how is that viewed by the populations of the Arab countries, not so much their leaderships, and how might that impact what's eventually negotiated? Will it matter, or does it really just matter what the leadership of the Arab countries think? Thank you.
I really appreciate that question because it gives me something that is subtle but very important, the difference between government positions and public positions on an issue like Iran, because we know that many of the governments in the Arab world don't like Iran and want to see it more pushed, and some even support war with Iran. But the Arab public, that's not the case. And let me give you two indicators. We've seen it consistently over a decade. One question is we ask the Arab public, including the Saudi public, including the public in Saudi Arabia, do you want the international community to pressure Iran, to pressure, not even military, to pressure Iran to curtail its nuclear program? Continuously, we get a majority saying no. And there are multiple reasons for it. One reason is they quote the double standard, say, why are you targeting a Muslim country, not Israel? Or why aren't we talking about a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East? Why are you just focused on Iran? That's one reason. But there's more to it than that. Because when we ask, name the two countries that pose the biggest threat to you personally, it's an open question I ask in every country. I get some, overall in the 6 countries, aggregate results, I get something like this. Roughly 80% say Israel first, roughly 70% say the US second, and less than 20% say Iran. So when they see Iran as a threat, but they don't see it as a big threat, and they evaluate everything in terms of will Israel and the US get an upper hand vis-a-vis Iran, and they don't think that's a good thing. So yes, that's how they see it, and that does influence some of the positions, particularly the position of the Egyptian government on Iran.
Bill Bell, I want to take another take on what happened to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. I've been over there quite a few times and kept up, and I was actually talking with the U.S. Embassy up in the UN, because, you know, I was surprised. I said no one's really caught on to this theory of what really happened in that country. And if you look at Egypt over the last 50 years, women had the rights of freedom of doing whatever they wanted to. And what I thought the Muslim Brotherhood, their mistake was they tried to pull back go back into a typical Islamic country, taking away women's rights. And when they did that...
Bill, do you have a question?
Yeah, what I'm going back to, I really believe that it was the women that really caused the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood. And if you don't believe that it can happen, look at what Obama did to Mitt Romney when he had a terrible economy. He used the women's issue. And then the next really test is going to be Afghanistan, because women have had rights when we took over that country. And to sit there and think that after we leave, if they go back to the old days, will that have an effect in that country and then cause another revolution? But I'm the belief that the Muslim Brotherhood's mistake was really sitting there trying to go back 50 years with women's rights.
Well, I think the women's issue is hugely important. I think it's good that you pointed out. Actually, in the book, I have a whole section dealing with it. But just one quick thing on really in some ways agreeing with you, and it's broader than just the women issue. When we ask people in Egypt, for example, say, do you support Sharia Islamic law being the basis of the Constitution? We get 2/3 who say yes. And so if you look at it just plainly and you're a Muslim Brotherhood, you think, well, you know, I can just apply Sharia, and meaning in some ways my interpretation of Sharia to things like women's issues. But when you ask these same people, the 2/3, who say they want Sharia law to be a basis of the Constitution, do you want Sharia law to be interpreted literally, or do you want it to be adapted to modern times? You have over 80% say adapted to modern times. So that assertion of Sharia is just like what I said early on about their assertion of being a Muslim. It's like, yes, I'm a Muslim at a time when they think people are criticizing Islam, say, I'm defiantly a Muslim. Of course I'm a Muslim. Of course I believe in Sharia. But when you ask them more specifically about how they want to live their lives, it's a different story. So people misinterpret that, and I think the Brotherhood made that mistake as well.
Hi, Jeff Thomas. Thank you for your time today. You spoke at the beginning about an increase in Muslim identity as opposed to national identity, but no increase in political Islam, or that not necessarily a correlation. How the revolution was about dignity. but how Al Jazeera manages to reach across borders. So basically, my question is, instead of pointing out what's not working, how is Al Jazeera able to reach a pan-Arab audience from different countries and all over, and what could we in the Western community do to relate?
That's great. I actually have a whole chapter on Al Jazeera specifically, just a chapter specifically on that channel, because I've followed that very closely from the beginning. I appear on them regularly. I'm, one of their on Al Jazeera Arabic. I mean, I do Al Jazeera in America and English as well, but I've been doing Al Jazeera Arabic for a long time, so I really understand them. I talked to the Emir about it, the former Emir of Qatar, who started it, and I quote him in there about sort of what his vision was. And I think one of the things that people don't understand is that Jazeera succeeded not because it put in so much something revolutionary in terms of content. They were the first television station that understood their audiences and catered to it. So when there was a Gaza war, they knew that Arabs care about this issue. They wanted to see what's happening on the ground. They can put 7 reporters from different places covering it. No one else was doing that. And so they're watching. The same thing with the Iraq war, and they put commentary and differences of opinion, the likes of which were not available on the media. So the bottom line, I think Al Jazeera's success has been principally having the patience and the astuteness to understand that if you want to get market share, you better understand your consumer. And I think they did that better than anybody else. And now that they may be having a little problem because of competition and because maybe some people see them as pitching a political agenda, their market share is probably going to decline.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shana Reynolds, and I am a cadet at the Military and Global Leadership Academy at Marie G. Davis. I have a question regarding the impact of social media on the current situation in the Middle East as a whole. Do you think it has helped or harmed the environment in the Middle East?
As a social scientist, I don't really look at it as helping or hurting. I look at it as being consequential. There's undoubtedly a huge impact. And it's, people think of the social media just simply as Twitter or Facebook or these things that we tend to do. I think the internet has been really consequential. And it's been consequential in some ways more, if you look at the whole decade, satellite television transformed public opinion by taking away the narrative from the rulers. But the social media and the internet are interactive. So even aside from their opening the world to the audiences, you are a participant in it. And so it is empowering. And that empowerment is consequential. In fact, when I look at how quickly the internet and social media expanded, it's really a window of 5 years only. We've been measuring it. This is one of the things I measure in my public opinion polling. And you can't understand the timing of the Arab uprisings in 2010, 2011, without reference to that revolution of the social media and the internet. And to my mind, what we're witnessing in that revolution is similar to the consequences of the Industrial Revolution in the West. When you reflect back historically and say, what has been the most important consequence of the Industrial Revolution for politics and society is the rise of individual empowerment. When individual starts earning wages and starts calling for more rights, whether in society or in politics, it's the rise of individualism. Well, you have the same thing happening, not through this economic revolution, but the information revolution. Expectations are rising. People see what's happening with the rest of the world. The sharing, people understand that what they think is their view is actually shared by millions of others. They see that when they tweet something, oh my Lord, it's carried by 5,000 people. My voice is suddenly heard. My voice is consequential. It's incredibly empowering. And so in that sense, I think it's revolutionary.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Wendy Yang, and I have a question. I'm studying Arabic right now, and I'm planning to go visit the Arabic countries in the Middle East. So in your opinion, how do you see the future after Arab Springs?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you're studying Arabic. It's a great thing. I think that, as I tell you, I'm first and foremost an educator. And when students come to me and say, what should I do coming to my university, whichever institution, every institution I serve with, I say the first thing is learn a foreign language, and the second thing, have a study abroad period. Because those two are more profoundly important, more profoundly consequential than anything I'm going to teach you in the classroom. And undoubtedly, and we all understand this is a group that doesn't need that pitching, but I think, first of all, that you're doing the right thing. Number two, the Middle East is going to be a fascinating, it's always been a fascinating place. It's even going to be more fascinating in the next decade. I'm in business for the long haul, and if you start going in there and watching it, nothing's going to be settled tomorrow. This is a huge societal transformation. Those don't settle in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, possibly not even within a decade or two. But it's the beginning of something big. And if you get in, you were still in the beginning of it. Yes, we say 3 years. Well, what's 3 years in the span of history? Nobody even notices it. You're only at the beginning, so do it.
Dr. Telhami, this has been very insightful. My name is Nico Kruger, and my question to you is, what is the view of the Arab people of a desired outcome in Syria, and do you think that is the likely outcome in Syria? And this is, in one way, a very personal question, because my brother-in-law, who's a French journalist, has been held hostage in Syria by ISIS for 7 months to this day.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. Syria is a heartbreak. Any of us who watch it, it's a human tragedy, and what makes it more tragic is that it's very hard to see an end in sight. But let me start with the first question, which is sort of how do the Arab people see it? When we started with the polling right after the Arab uprisings, I did ask a question, who do you want to see win, essentially? Whose side do you take, the Assad regime or the opposition? Assuming the opposition was unified, of course not. And initially, the Arab people thought of it like any other country, where they were taking the side of the people against the government, just like they did in Tunisia. So we had something like 80% up to almost 90% say they take the side of the people against the Assad regime. Now, that has remained roughly so, although the support for the quote, the opposition has declined, particularly in Egypt, where we see the Egyptians, in part because of their anger with the Muslim Brotherhood, they're worried about the rise of Islamist groups in Syria, to the point that they're not, necessarily feeling the same way. But throughout the whole period, even beginning with the early days when they were overwhelming against Assad, when you ask them, do you want the international community to intervene on behalf of the opposition against Assad, the majority say no. So even when they're angry with Assad, they don't think the solution is for the U.S. to intervene, not even the international community, not even the UN to intervene. They don't want to see foreign intervention. They think it would make it worse rather than better. But having said that, if you ask me, how is this going to shape up? I think we have to look at Syria as not one problem, but multiple problematic tragedies. One problem is the straightforward opposition to a dictatorship, undoubtedly. We saw that. That was the early part of it. There's still part of it. People don't want dictatorships in the Arab world. Another part of it is sectarianism. We've seen that. People fear that there's Druze and there's Alawis and there's Christians and there's Sunni Muslims. Another is secular versus religious. The Muslim Brotherhood was entrenched in Syria. There was a confrontation with the secular regime. Another is the new jihadist role of people who want to impose an Islamic State in Syria, remnants of what we see in the outside world, including in Iraq. And then there's the foreign interveners who are sponsors of proxies. Iran, taking the side of the regime, helping Hezbollah to intervene. Saudi Arabia and other GCC states, including Qatar, funding Sunni opposition group, including money that has, or weapons that apparently have made their way to the jihadist groups. Then you have the neighbors who have a stake, the Turks and the Jordanians and the Iraqis and the Lebanese. And then on top of that, you have Russia and the United States who've looked at this as a global issue on top of everything else. So you have a multi-layered, complex issue that is not likely to be resolved anytime soon. Yes, the tide has shifted in some ways in favor of the Assad regime, in part because of the intervention of Hezbollah, but there's another side of it. And that is that the rise of the jihadist, militant Islamist groups has scared people. It scared people on the outside, even the US, where you look around and the CIA tells the president, the only party that can stand up to the jihadists is the Syrian army. So whatever you do, don't destroy the Syrian army. And the other opposition groups are fragmented. They're now negotiating in Geneva. Now, the Geneva talks are not going to be able to solve this problem. But they are important for the following reason. Because having foreign actors intervene in Syria is such an integral part of the conflict. Today, for the first time in some ways, we have incentive for those foreign parties to come together. We saw that in Russia and the US over the chemical weapons issue, but what's driving that is the American fear of jihadists, which is very parallel to the Russian fear of jihadists. Iran has an interest in helping if they get invited again. They were invited and then disinvited. If they get invited again because they have a bigger fish to fry, which is the nuclear issue, and they want to be on good terms with the international community. The Saudis now know they can't resolve this on their own, and they don't want to be on a losing side. The only way for them to have a voice is to be involved. The Turks now have a domestic problem on their hand to deal with, and they don't want to be interventionists. So we suddenly have international incentive to cooperate. It's a good starting point because that can help manage the conflict and perhaps turn in some of the pressure on their sponsored groups internally. It doesn't solve it, but hopefully it will mitigate it or reduce it and maybe plant the seeds for a resolution down the road.
Thank you, Dr. Telhami. Emily Zimmerman, thanks so much for sharing and helping us understand such complicated questions. Could you give us your assessment of the Israeli-Palestinian talks? And part B, given what you said about 80% viewing Israel as the major threat, what would be the contours of an agreement that you think Arab public opinion would accept and support?
That's great. And I'm just give you a quick answer to that. First of all, on the Israel-Palestine question, one of the things, I have a chapter called The Prism of Pain in the book. And that, because I think that what's misunderstood about this conflict, of course, it's not the reason, it's not the source of problems in the Middle East, whether you have it or not. It's not going to solve, the political problem in Egypt or Tunisia or Bahrain. But it is the prism through which Arabs view the outside world, particularly the US. And I call it the prism of pain, and there's a lot of reasons for it, and there's a lot of documentation of that in the results that we found in that book. But when you ask people whether they would accept a two-state solution based on the 1967 boundaries, we find consistently 2/3 of the Arab public saying yes. 2/3 of the Arab public saying yes. But here's the problem, as the same problem it's reflected in the polling that I just did among Israelis and Palestinians, which is you can have a majority say, yes, I would support an agreement like that. But when you ask them, what's the chance that such an agreement is going to take place, you have 50% say it'll never happen. What's the chance that American mediation will work? Right now, among Palestinians, only 11% think it's going to succeed, and 4% of Israelis think it's going to succeed. So you have a mirror image of people who, in principle, are prepared to do it. They don't think the other side will accept it, and they're pessimistic about the prospect. So what we did in the most recent poll that I just released and shared it in Washington is we actually put a package deal along the lines that have been talked about, meaning compromise deal, what is called Clinton parameters plus on Jerusalem, on settlements, on the. And I went to the Israelis and Palestinians and said, I know you're pessimistic. I know when I ask you issue by issue, you say, I don't want to compromise. But let's assume here's a deal, and it includes the following, and I specify all the things that are in that deal. Same one to both sides. And let's assume that the other side will also accept this deal, because that's one of their reluctance. Then you get roughly 60% of both Israelis and Palestinians say they're prepared to accept it. So here is the thing, is that they don't believe, and they don't think it's going to happen. And when you don't think it's going to happen, you go into a mode of preparing for conflict, not of preparing for peace. And so it's very hard to do so, to get them to compromise, unless you have a whole deal put on the table. That's why the American approach now is to put a plan on the table. Whether it'll be enough or whether it'll have the right elements, whether leaders will accept it or not is another story. I happen to think if there is a deal along what's being talked about, put on the table, and then you have the Israeli leaders and the Palestinian leaders accept it, and they put it for referendum to their own people, it'll be accepted. That's my own view. And that's an optimistic note.
Hello, sir. Thank you for insight today. I'm Chris Domney. My question, in your opinion, how effective and how impactful are the economic sanctions on that region?
That's a really hard one, really, really hard one, because we have a whole literature. I'm a professor of international relations, and it's not like we don't have a lot of literature on sanctions. But when you review the literature on sanctions, it's been very mixed. I mean, of cases where it fails, cases where it succeeds, cases where it complicates, cases where it opens door, cases where it has no consequence. So it's all over the map. It's very hard to know, the circumstance under which it'll work. Now, with Iran specifically, if that's what you're referring to in particular, sanctions on Iran, there is no question that those sanctions have had an economic consequence for Iran. No one doubts that, and particularly when they became international sanctions. As you know, unilateral American sanctions didn't have much of an impact, in large part because, if you don't sell something to Iran, someone else is going to sell it to them, or and so forth. So it opens up business possibilities for the Chinese or the Russians or the Europeans. But when you have international agreement, as this administration tried to do, there's no question that it has had consequence for Iranian economy. That everybody agrees on. The question is whether it has softened their position on foreign policy. Now, what we find, and on this issue, is that one indicator that people use is the Iranian election itself. Remember, we had a hardline Iranian president, Ahmadinejad, whose term ended, and then there was a presidential election that people didn't know who was going to win, but they were favoring a conservative close ally of the supreme leader. And lo and behold, unexpectedly, the most liberal candidate of all wins this election, who was more open to the international community, more open on the nuclear issue, and focused on the economic issue. So people said, well, maybe that's an outcome of the sanctions, and it might be. But here's the interesting thing. We have a student from the University of Maryland, whose dissertation committee I serve, who now teaches at the University of Tehran. They have now an arm which does public opinion polling in Iran. So he did what people do, which is public opinion polling, trying to analyze the Iranian elections, and came to Washington. I moderated his panel in Washington, his results of his finding. And so what he found, documenting before the election, through the election, after the election, is that the Iranian people definitely are focused on the economy. So you can argue, well, the economy, they want the economy improved. And obviously the economy has worsened because of the sanctions. So you can say, well, sanctions had an impact. But what he also found is that in their own mind, somehow they don't link this with the nuclear issue at all. So they don't link it with the nuclear issue. They think that they shouldn't compromise on, or it's not connected, or if improving the economy means that you have to give up on principles on the right to enrich, they don't see the linkage. And what's interesting is the Iranian public, including the liberal Iranian public, has been supportive of the government's position on the nuclear issue, meaning that Iran has the right to enrich on its soil. Remember, Iran has never said it's building nuclear weapons. In fact, they've said 100% they're not doing so, and they even went to the extent of having a religious finding by the supreme leader that it's anti-Islamic to have nuclear weapons, and that they would never do such a thing, and that only they're doing is what they're asserting their right in terms of building their peaceful nuclear capabilities any state would have, and therefore the public fully supports them on this one. And so that's the linkage here. So was this because of the sanctions? Probably it had an impact. Would this then carry them into a nuclear compromise? Hard to know. I don't think it's not such a direct, straight line.
Hi, my name is Graham Mazine. I'm a student at Charlotte Country Day School. I wanted to ask how public opinion in the Arab world about U.S. drone strikes differed from region to region or country to country or even within a population along demographic lines, and what the consequences of those differences might be.
Thanks. I personally have not done polling on the drone issue, so I can't tell you what the public opinion say, but I could tell you, as my own information is not just public opinion. As someone who goes there, consumes the media, reads it, talk to people, have a sense. I think it's at the public opinion level, it's universally rejected, and you don't find really anybody supporting it in the media, including by pro-U.S. media outlet, in large part because they see it as not only intrusion into their sovereignty, that's the one issue, of course, that's clear, including among Pakistanis, but they see it as hurting civilians, and the media does report the civilian casualties all the time. So that's, of course, different from ruling elites who might criticize it publicly but welcome it privately, as is the case with the Yemeni government, which clearly sees al-Qaeda as a threat to itself that it can't handle otherwise, and that in some ways welcomes the American intervention and actually coordinates and cooperates with it, while its public feels differently.
Dr. Telhami, on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, I want to thank you very much for coming today and giving us your insights on the Middle East, a complex region with multiple questions, and I think you've helped shed some of the light of that region for us today. And I want to present to you, on behalf of the World Affairs Council, our certificate of appreciation. Rather than give you a 10-pound paperweight to carry back in your luggage, we'll give you something for your wall.
Great.
And I want to thank you very much for coming today and appreciate your
Thank you
thoughts.
very much.
Thank you very
Appreciate it.
much.
Thanks.